Awesome. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Austin Peterson. I'm the president of Belong, and I'm joined here we're testing out an idea of some topical discussions. And so we're excited to start off this first one. I'm joined by Jeff Case, who's a member of our board. Jeff is a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma and suicide. He's a veteran and works with veterans. And you're probably going to recognize him because he was one of our directors at the Utah conference last June. And he's going to have a conversation today with Claire. Claire is our vice president of Belong, and she is going to be a session director at our upcoming Belong Arizona in this March.
So excited, really excited to have it and for this conversation. We are going to focus our conversation tonight on the creation stories in the Bible, and specifically with the creation stories as told in Genesis 1 and 2, and then for the different stories that we have in there. We have multiple creation stories kind of all crammed into the beginning of the Bible, and we kind of refer to it as like just the creation story. And if we kind of expand our view and we look across different religions and cultures and like really storytelling, we have a lot of different stories about creations, and all of them have different elements. A lot of them have really common, similar elements, and we can pull different lessons. We can learn different things from them. And so we wanted to kind of focus our conversation tonight on maybe what we feel like is the most common interpretation of the creation story that we are really used to hearing in Genesis and talking about these opposing binaries, right? So when God creates the world and he separates in these two categories, we have light and dark, and then we're going to have earth, and we're going to have water and the ocean and different things. And so we have this binary retelling, and that is interpreted for some people very narrowly, very literally, that like these are the two things that are the opposites, and this is what the emphasis of the story is. And I think that we can kind of expand our view of what the story could teach us and what lessons are there for us that maybe we haven't heard before in the past. So we're going to start with that conversation. So Jeff, get us started on an idea or a thought. What's in here that maybe we might overlook or perspective we don't focus on?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's important to kind of recognize the poetic nature of Genesis or any of the creation stories in the LDS culture with in the Pearl of Great Price and Moses and Abraham with the different places that we hear the creation story. And I think there is kind of this poetic beauty to the binary, right? That we have these two things. And I love that you kind of called them sort of opposing, but there's this, yeah, light and dark.
Complementary.
I think complementary is better, right? I think harmony
Yep.
through difference is part of the creation story, right? And that there is initially this kind of separation between like light and dark, and yeah, land and water, and then like land and atmosphere, right? And then in various other places. And then I think the pinnacle of the creation story for most of us is the creation of Adam and Eve, right? And it looks like this binary kind of holds up, and I think I think it's worth noting that this is sort of how we're kind of taught, um, and then it's easy to kind of get in the mindset that or at least to kind of fail to recognize the many places where the binary is the rule, but also the places where these things do meet, and what diversity exists in the places where these things meet. The part of the creation story that for me I really love is that there is diversity and variety by design. Like the word variety shows up a lot in the creation story. That it's not just mammals, right? That the fish in the ocean and the mammals on land and the birds in the sky, right? That there's also this place where all these things sort of meet. We have birds that don't fly, right?
Right.
But they're birds, right? And we have these creatures that kind of cohabitate both land and water. They're neither fish nor mammals, reptiles, lizards, and amphibians and other forms. I'm not a biologist, but that while there are these things that seem set up to be the rule, there's a whole lot of stuff kind of in between.
Yeah, which is really beautiful to like point out. Like, I don't know if this was Austin's first time, but we were ended up on a trip together in Hawaii, and we saw flying fish, and I had never seen flying fish before, and it was so cool to see them. Like, I thought they just like, are out of the water for a little bit, but they were going like 30, 40, 50 yards. It was really cool to see, and so I love that idea of the poetic nature of this, right? The literary devices that are being used. Obviously, it's a translation from Hebrew, but there's this idea that I like to see the binary as like capstones, right? That are like, here's this end of this variety, and here's another end, and there's so much in between. There's so much beauty. I'm not saying that it has to be one or two, but it's you break down numbers. There's so many options in between that, and to see that variety, that God is good. God creates so much. Like we could have a very stale earth. Like we don't need all of the variety that we have, but God has given us so much and such differentiation that is so beautiful that I really also, that adds to my testimony in seeing how we're created with different gender identities, expressions, and orientations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that is evidence of God's love that we don't just have one thing. I mean, one of my favorite mammals lives in the ocean, right? And some of the coolest mammals actually live in the ocean. They're supposed to be on land. They breathe air. They're warm-blooded, but whales and dolphins and I think that just it adds interest, right? It adds intrigue. Um, and so if you look at these places, it's easy to kind of get this idea that these things are separate. And like I think Clara calling them bookends is exactly right. Like dry land, we know dry land, and there's a lot of it around. You can kind of look at it. I'm facing these mountains right now that look like dry land, and
In
that
Utah
dry
and
land.
Arizona, especially, we're in two deserts. We've got lots of it, and it's very dry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no point in between, right? And then we also have like these great big lakes out here, and most of the water exists kind of in the middle of the lake, right? Most of the water on earth exists in the oceans. And so if you're an ocean and you're sitting kind of in that space, then you don't understand what happens when water meets land. And if you're a mountain, you don't understand what happens when water meets land. But to deny that even like gender exists only on a binary is to deny the existence of marshlands and the places where land and water meet, full of life, teeming with life. So much life exists in the places where land and water meet, along the shorelines or in the wetlands where our birds are migrating, and there's so much life and diversity. I think also with like the light and the dark, the vast majority of light exists in the daytime. The vast majority of the dark exists at nighttime. But when they kind of meet, right? We just saw a spectacular sunset. And in fact, like when we're observing a sunset, we're observing a broader range of the spectrum of light in the moment where light and dark kind of meet, instead of just like blue, right? Which is midday light, or black, or whatever, midnight darkness, right? But like when they kind of meet, we see a broader spectrum of light. We understand light better in the places where it's neither light nor dark. It's kind of a little bit of both.
Austin, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, that's great. I'm thinking of like some of these examples too, where, like the ones you gave that are very explicit as separate. I think when we look at, one of my favorites is the waters above and the waters below, right? And,
Mhm.
you've got clouds going off in the sky and sometimes it rains, and then you've got like the oceans and water down here. Um, and it's very unusual to see water in the middle. Occasionally we'll get just a gorgeous fog that'll roll in. Again, being in the desert, this happens very infrequently. I've been in other places of the world where it happens on the daily. We don't get it very much here, but it's really beautiful when that water is in the middle. But that is an example of things where it's predominantly in the binary. Um, Whereas, like in Genesis 1:24, in 24 and 25, it says, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle
Mm.
and creeping things, and the wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, the cattle and of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw it was good. And I don't, and this is one where it's a lot harder to see this as a binary, right? There's two categories, right? It talks about cattle, and it talks about creeping things. Um, and I don't think anybody in the world is going to look at that and be like, yep, that is all the animals. That is all the things on the land is either cattle or creeping things. Like just so many things are not even close to either of those
Mhm.
to try and categorize. And so that kind of shows, in different things you might have a more separated or as instead of a bell curve, right, you have an anti-bell curve with things more separated into the two sides, and in other ones it's more in the middle where I look at like animals, and that's an even distribution. There's just all sorts of things everywhere.
Yeah.
But even that idea of like cattle, right? That term is culturally specific. Different cultures herd and tame different animals to be cattle, right? And so there's a
Hmm.
cultural component to understanding what the Lord or God intended by the word cattle, right? Some cultures, horses are for transportation, and others are a source of meat or more cattle. And there's a cultural component to that.
Yeah.
Herding
And
reindeer up in Norway versus we don't do that down here, right?
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's sad to it's hard sometimes when you're sitting and people will use some verses out of these first to go, well, God created male and female, that's it, right? That's it, that's all there is. And that can be a really uncomfortable, difficult thing for LGBTQ individuals to sit through. Like imagine like when you're young and you're figuring it out and you feel different and hearing people say it's got to be this or this, and then people tell you who you are. And I think a lot of us know who we are, and the struggle is to trust that we know who we are and that that's what's right. And so these can sometimes be weaponized against people. And I think that, when that happens, it's not always a productive conversation to fight it in the moment, right? And to tell people why they're wrong, and why it's painful. But to understand and sit with these verses and really go, okay, if this is a verse that someone is yelling at me, or it's on a sign, or someone saying, because of this, you're not valid, you don't exist. When I have some time to sit and to just be in that dissonance and figure out, well, what are these verses saying? I've had to go back through and kind of look through these chapters and go, okay, what's before those verses, what's after, what's the context that they're in, and seeing that God isn't saying these are the only two things I've created, but to say I've created male and I've created female, and those are the bookends for everything in between. And we see examples of that, right, in the world around us. That is a fact that we have people who are across a spectrum and a binary as far as gender identity and orientation. And what is God trying to teach here? Is God trying to teach us something about his creations that is a yes or a no, check the box? Or is God trying to present the beauty of the variety that God has created for us to be able to see? And so there's something that I learned, and this is just a fun word. I like to learn words, but merism is the word for when it's a figure of speech. It's a rhetorical device that you can use where you take two two components of a whole and you use them as a placeholder to describe the whole, and it can be poetic. So one example comes from a Celine Dion song, right? So the lyrics where you say like near, far, what is we trying to say? We're talking about wherever you are, right? It's not just the near or the far. It encapsulates all of that. And so to see these merisms that are opening our eyes to understanding that if I'm here, I don't have to say, oh my gosh, yes, I'm only this or I'm only this. I can stand exactly where I'm at and find beauty here. That God says, yes, I've created all of this and you're a part of my creations. And there's power and there's sacredness and there's sanctity with who you are and where you stand. And like that's part of our journey is figuring out where that is for us. And hopefully undoing some of those maybe decisions that other people have made outside of it, like Jeff said, right? Where if it's not their experience, they don't know. If I have never been into the ocean, I may have no kind of comparison, understanding what that's like, what's in there, and what that experience is. So then I'm going to have to take a visit, or I'm going to have to listen to people who say, hey, I know you're used to Arizona. it's a little bit different when you're living on an island, when you're living in a completely different area of the world. Do I trust their experience and try to incorporate that into my worldview to expand my appreciation and knowledge for what's around me? Or do I close the door and say, no, I know my experience, I'm right, you're wrong?
Right. Yeah, that those are all really great examples of kind of what we're trying to illustrate and to kind of understand with this creation, right? That there, um, it can seem incomprehensible because most of us identify as cisgender, and we know statistically speaking that that having a transgender identity or an intersex condition is a very small minority, not a small number, but a small percentage perhaps. Um, and so for the vast majority of us that identify as cisgender, right? I think it's unless you kind of sit in the space of somebody who has a different gender identity or things don't match the way that we think they ought to, or that or based on the rule, right? It's hard maybe to kind of comprehend unless you're willing to kind of sit in that space, unless you're a mountain willing to travel out to a wetland, or unless you're the ocean willing to kind of come inland a little bit. It's going to be a hard thing to understand.
Yeah.
But we know that, in the creation story, there is a commandment to kind of to place things, animal life, vegetable life, vegetation, in all the variety, right? Would our a loving Father stop at all variety with people? We know that there are many different variations of people, right? That add to the uniqueness, that add to um, sort of the specialness of our creation, right? If we were all the same, can you imagine how boring that would be? We need
Yes, I can't
all
imagine how
the
boring that would be.
yeah, yeah. There was actually an episode of Fairly Odd Parents, which I think is way existential. If you haven't seen it, go watch Fairly Odd Parents. But Timmy wished from his fairy godparents that everyone was the same. He was tired of some kids being special and other kids being subpar. He wanted everyone to be the same, and they all turned into these gray blobs that were unrecognizable. And very, very quickly, of course, chaos ensues. The lesson being that if we were all the same, how boring would that be? It would not complement, I think, God's grand design for the earth, right? If we only ate the same foods and we had to eat only specific vegetation or specific cattle, right? It'd be very boring, right? So I think that part of the grand design that makes our experience here rich and full is in all their forms and all the variety that a thing can exist.
Yeah,
And so
would we be
therefore,
able to fulfill the measure of our creation if we didn't have that variety? I really like that point of understanding that it's the variety that allows us to fulfill the measure of our creation. That's cool.
yeah, I
Mhm.
think so. Right. It's what attracts us to each other, right? It's what maybe complements our discussions. Like some of these ideas that I'm presenting today they're not my own. These are things that I've heard from other people who have sat with these things differently, and I really appreciate their perspectives because it kind of helps me understand better my own paradigms.
Yeah. I wonder if we could think of any examples of a time when someone, because they saw things so differently than we did, they added something that, stands out to us now or we can't forget or that we're sitting with. And I know like I just sprung that on you. So I'll give an example what you guys are thinking. I just thought of a really quick one. I have a friend who has been on a orientation and gender just expression journey, trying to figure it out, has gone through multiple different phases of, this is the label that best fits me, and this is the label that best fits me now, and it's different, and these are the pronouns I want to use, and it has been really beautiful to see that of kind of how they're growing into themselves. And I remember when they first started using they them pronouns. Um, Someone asked them about what we could do at church to make them feel more comfortable, and they had an immediate answer, and they said, when we get up and say welcome brothers and sisters or something like that, like I immediately feel excluded. And that had never entered into my like just registry, right? I don't think about that because I feel like I'm represented in that, so it's never rubbed me the wrong way. And they said it would be so simple for people to just say welcome friends or even welcome children of God. And like that just clicked something for me that if I can try to find a way to do that, then that is how I want to do that in case there is someone out there who feels that way. And I never would have thought of that. I never would have been attentive or attuned to that. And it's such an easy little switch that I can tell means so much to them that that's something that I can do. And so I don't know, that was just something that I thought about that I wouldn't have noticed without them.
And I was thinking a little less personally, but I was thinking about just like autism and people who are autistic, and while they may see the world very differently and have very different social behaviors than most neurotypical people will, they also contribute just incredible things to our society. Like the number of people, the percentages in like Silicon Valley, the people who are working on our computers and making software and making these amazing innovations that we appreciate every day. Like so many of them are artistic. Like when we look back, like this was before we had official diagnoses and things, but like Alan Turing, like the father of computing, like probably was autistic as well. Um, and just this string of people who think differently and allows them to create different things that we all benefit from in a very like tangible way as far as like inventions and things.
That I live to use and do not understand, right? Does not
Yeah.
make sense to my brain, but I'm so glad that someone else speaks that language because they're doing fantastic jobs in ways that I would not be able to get my brain to think in that way. That just comes naturally to them. What a cool gift.
Yeah, I think I'm a musician in a past life. That was what I did a lot of, but it's the combining of these different instruments that kind of bring different texture, different timbre. I had the perspective of being in the brass section, and I wanted to do a thing in the brassness of the brassiness of a brass section. And I wanted that to come out, but that by itself doesn't make any sense if I'm not paying attention to like the woodwinds and the strings and the percussion, and it's in the listening, right, of what's kind of happening around the orchestra, that really kind of provides for a cohesive, perhaps, experience with the music, with the listening, is the interplay of them and the beauty that they kind of all bring together. But from my perspective, initially, I was just like, I'm here to play loud notes because that's what we do in the brass section. But it wasn't about that, right?
And played at
Mhm.
the right time, the right way, add such flavor. And it makes me sad sometimes that like in church settings where we're had a culture in the past that has said like certain instruments cannot be played in these
Yeah.
settings has like been really upsetting when I have seen, beautiful the ability to play an amazing trumpet solo or anything like that. Like that could add so much to worship. And yet we've kind of pegged certain things as like that cannot be in this situation. You can't play it softly, so it can't be here. And I'm like, I disagree. I think that that can add a lot of flavor.
So my roommates and I in college, we did a brass quartet. I had two trumpet players and a trombone player roommate, and we did a brass quartet in our sacrament meeting, in our student ward. And because we know how to play soft, we know how to play lush, and
Yes.
change the timbre of the instrument to meet the demands of the music, right?
Yeah.
And I recall the stake president was visiting, and he saw us setting up our brass instruments and our music stands, so that way it's all set up. We could just like walk forward and play. And he turned to the bishop and he said, "Those gentlemen they have brass instruments." And the bishop said, "Yes, yes, they are, and you're
Yes.
and you're gonna love it."
I love that.
And and so we played. And afterwards, he came up to us and he said, "I had a preconceived notion about what a trumpet would sound like in church, and I was wrong. And I was wrong because you were willing to share with me, and I was willing to listen, and to say I now have a deeper understanding of what reverent music can look like. It doesn't have to fit a certain mold."
I love that. Absolutely love
So
that.
as we think about the creation of humans, which I do have a testimony of the Bible and these stories, um, there is a necessity with Adam and Eve being sort of male and female, although we could argue that Eve's DNA was much more like Adam's because of how. Anyway, that's a whole different story. Um, but there was a necessity, right? And of course, the fall of Adam occurs. They leave the Garden of Eden and enter into a different existence. And so there are some, and I've heard this many times, who will say the LGBTQ existence is because of the fall of Adam and evidence of the fall. Have you guys heard this? Um, and I have to counter that with, well, every single person born after Adam and Eve is a result of the fall of Adam,
Right.
right? Every condition of our mortality is a result of the fall. Why do you have to just say, well, queer people are a result of the fall? I say, you as a straight person are a result of the fall.
Yeah. And yeah, yeah, a lot of places to go there on that one, but I think a good illustration of how these can be misconstrued or even just misused, misunderstood that don't need to be, it doesn't need to go there. It doesn't need to be that. It can stand on its own legs of the beauty that is held within and the lessons that are there without, turning into a club and beating someone over the head with it on that. Any other like last ideas or thoughts? And if we don't have one, then I kind of got an idea that we can roll with. But anything that we haven't mentioned yet that is on your minds?
Well, I think Austin, you talked about like the water cycle, right, of clouds and oceans, and we don't see a lot of it, but there's a real dynamic there, right? That gives water to the entire planet, that keeps us all alive, and it is the evaporation, condensation, and precipitation, right? A process that we only see part of, right? But because of this invisible process, life exists as we know it, and we wouldn't have that. And so I think there are places where we can understand where it may not be visible, right? Someone's gender identity may not be visible to the outward eye. In fact, a lot of times it's not, and certainly with intersex conditions, not always visible, and discovered only later or through testing that we can understand kind of a person's genetic chromosomal hormonal makeups. But through invisible processes, their life exists, and I think that happens with all of creation, and it didn't stop when God created Adam and Eve.
I love that. Yeah, beautiful thought.
I wanted to add too, like one of the things I love about the creation story is the poetry of it because it's all a mirror. And so days one, two, and three, God is creating something, and then four, five, and six, he fills those. So one creates light and dark, and then four puts the sun and the moon in it. Two, there's the waters above and the waters below. Five, we have the fish and the birds. And then three is the separation of the water from the water and the land comes out. And so it's between the land and the water, and then you have the cattle and the creeping things. And then the other half of day three is that he creates the herbs bearing seed and the trees bearing fruit. Um, and then on the last half of day six, creates male and female to be a mirror of that one. Um, and I just think about that of like, again, if we're comparing men and women to herbs and trees, it's like, okay, so like what kind of tree though? Like, are you an apple tree or an orange tree or like a banana tree, which is a berry of some kind? Like there's a lot of ways to do tree, right? There's a lot of ways to do herb. Like, are you going to be, if you're bearing seed, like, are you rice? Are you like wheat? Are you mint or thyme? Are you, and then all the other, how many flowers do we have? How many other plants? Like, just there's this huge spectrum within each category and then between the categories, and I just whether we look at that as your gender expression, whether you look at that as your orientation and identity, whether that's how you think, how you behave, even if it's I'm very much this, but also I'm very much a cis man, but also like I like painting my nails sometimes, or there's just this broad spectrum, and the creation really shows that if we look at the story in that way of it being expansive in that way. So I just wanted to add that at the end.
Yeah,
I
absolutely. I
like
love
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that word expansive is really great because I think that is God is big, right? And anything that is big, anything that's expansive, I think we can say is manifestation of God.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I would just say for someone who has maybe not had a good experience with scripture or with this scripture, or maybe someone has used this against them and so it feels dissonant or painful, I would hope that that person could um, have an experience outside of that that isn't an external pushing on who they are, but more of an internal experience of being able to sit with who you are and your divine origins. And I mean, even just walk outside and look at the world that we live in And I think as we start to really think about what's around us, what do we see? All of the different experiences that we have, we see variety. And if I know something about nature, it's that it always continues to surprise me. Where if I'm online and I'm reading something, or I will come across a fact that I didn't know, something that surprises me about this world that we live in that I haven't experienced yet. And I just go back to that with God, that God has so many surprises. There's so many things that we don't know and understand. And when I have gone to the source, to ask God about who I am. How do you feel about me? What is my creation story? Why am I here? What's the full measure of my creation? And stop comparing it to what other people tell me it's supposed to be, but experiencing it internally, into my external world. I have found more joy and more understanding and more just like a settledness with that. And so I hope that every person can have that in some way, whatever it looks like to you, to realize that your origins are divine and that you're not a mistake, and that there is so much for you to learn about the world around you, and for us as the world around you to learn about you, and just the beauty in both sides of that.
Yeah, and really the creation story teaches us how intentional creation is. And it was intentional by a loving Father in heaven and intentional by our loving Savior. And we were intended to be created. These aren't accidents, these aren't mistakes. This is intentional. And the intention is love, right? God is love. And so the intention that he does in creation is love.
Yeah. And I hope that we can feel that, we can see that, and we can contribute that to the world around us and what we do. So thank you so much for this discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I have some more thoughts that I want to, as soon as we click off of here, I want to write some things down. But thanks for helping me kind of go back into these verses and scriptures and have some new ideas and concepts that I want to go back in and look at and study, and just sharing your thoughts. And I think that that is the beauty of discussion, right? Is hearing someone else's take and adding that flavor into it to create something than if I had just sat down and asked my own thoughts. What do I think about these chapters? I never would have got to the discussion that we had without it. So thanks for that. And I hope that we have started some thoughts for other people, or that they, get the conversation rolling in their own way and with their own circle of friends. And so just thank you for the time that we've had, and look forward to seeing you soon.